thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Vanessa Sage, co-senior curator at Figge Art Museum, and tonight's program is Visualizing the Feline Art by Dr. Amy Freund and Dr. Michael Yonan, and it's held in conjunction with the Cats exhibition on the third floor of the Figge, on view now through January 4th, 2026. A special thank you to the sponsors for the Cats exhibition, Carrie Kimple and Sue Quayle, and to the lenders to the exhibition, the Putnam Museum and Science Center. These Thursday night events are always free due to the generosity of Chris and Mary Rayburn. Now to introduce our distinguished speakers. Amy Freund is an associate professor and holds the Kleinheinz Endowment for the Arts and Education Endowed Chair in Art History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. She is a specialist in 18th century European art with special interest in the history of portraiture and in the visual representation of animals. Her most recent book, Noble Beasts, Hunters and Hunted in 18th-Century French Art, will be published by Yale University Press in 2026. Dr. Michael Yonan is Allen Templeton Endowed Professor in the History of European Art, 1600 to 1830, at the University of California, Davis. He is the author of Empress Maria Theresa and the Politics of Habsburg Imperial Art, and Messerschmitt's Character Heads, Maddening Sculpture and Writing of Art History, among other publications on Rococo art, monarchical portraiture, porcelain, and material culture theory. Amy Freund and Michael Yonan have published 2 articles on cats and art, including Cats, the Soft Underbelly of the Enlightenment, and Feline Creativity on the Eve of Modernity, and are currently working on a book about the visual representation of cats and artists in early modern and modern European and American art, which they confidently predict will change the practice of art history forever. So please keep your eyes out for that. Now there will be a brief Q&A following the presentation, so please keep your questions in mind for the end. And now join me in welcoming our speakers with a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction.
Well, first we want to offer our thanks to Vanessa for inviting us. We've had an amazing time already, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a beautiful Thursday night to talk about cats. We wanted to start off a little bit by telling you how we got into this mess together. We've been friends and colleagues for a very long time. We both are cat lovers. Many years ago, Michael decided to organize a panel at a conference about cats and art. And I was like, I was very excited. I presented a paper, and it was so much fun. I was like, we have to keep this ball rolling. So first we wrote one article about cats and art in the 18th century, which is both of our specialties. Then we were like, why don't we continue into the 19th century? So then we wrote another article about cats and art. And at that point, we're like, we should write a book about this. So we've taken that. We're delighted to take the show on the road. We are co-authors. We're going to kind of alternate up here at the lectern. We have a question for you before we get started. Raise your hand if you have a picture of a cat on your phone. Well, we are all in this room both creators and consumers of cats and art, and that is one of the reasons we know that this is a burning topic that is of great interest to both the art historical world and to the general public.
Absolutely.
We are joining a distinguished group of scholars, shall we say. Well, we're joining a lot of books about art.
A lot of books about art. So I took this picture recently when I was in Boston. I think this is about a year ago at the MFA Boston, just to show the number of cat-themed art books that are on display in that museum. And I will tell you that that is not a unique situation. If you go to pretty much any art museum in the country, anywhere, north, south, west, east, you will find that they have a selection of animal books that may have nothing to do with what's actually in the museum. And those books are overwhelmingly about cats. That's, of course, also true here at the Figge gift shop. You know, some of those books are here because of the cat exhibition that has been arranged upstairs. But that also is not unique. You see these cat books in every single museum you go to. So there's some sort of connection there. And we began to ask questions about why the community of people who love art, the people who make art, and cats seem to always be in the same space.
I think you're
Yes.
still on.
Oh, yes. So there is a very long history of representing cats in art. And one of the things that actually the show upstairs does a very good job of demonstrating is that this is something that has an extremely ancient history. Now, you might think, well, artists have made works of art about all sorts of things across the millennia. That's certainly true, but the farther back you go, I mean, almost, to the beginning of any kind of activity that we know artists did, you will find images of felines of one kind or another. And it is a strange continuity across cultures and across historical periods that whenever someone decides to make a picture, one of the things they want to make a picture of is a cat. And sometimes these cats have become very famous because of their associations with the cultures that they came from. And just to give two examples, we have an ancient Egyptian cat here. You have some examples of Egyptian cat imagery. The Egyptians, of course, worshipped cats, right? They had a sort of sacred role in that society. And then Andy Warhol, just to bring it to a more recent contemporary American artist, was a big lover of cats and did a whole series of cats over the course of his career. So just to show you the 5,000 years that we have here, you get a sense of how many different cultures were making images of cats.
So we're faced with a glut of evidence for our research, and so we started asking ourselves questions: Why? Why are artists so obsessed with cats? Why do we keep seeing them? And we've come up with a list of reasons for you tonight. There are even more, but one of them is just about aesthetics.
Yes. So cats are beautiful, right? Let's just say that. Cats are very pretty. They're beautiful to look at. They have beautiful form. They move with great elegance. They have interesting coat colors. All of those things make cats extremely appealing. And of course, if you know cats, you live with a cat, they're very aware of how beautiful they are, right? So they're incredibly good at making you look at them. There was a recent study that I read about in the media that reported that from a design perspective, the cat is absolutely the perfect animal. It's just the perfect design if you want a small mammal that will kill small rodents. This is pretty much the perfect design that you could have for that. They're aerodynamic, they have fast reflexes, they're excellent hunters, and they're physically appealing. And just to illustrate that, we have an actual cat at the top, and then a beautiful 17th century Dutch print of a cat to show an artist really taking the beauty of the cat and making it the focus of a work of art.
There's also, and in some ways, a contradictory impulse to think of cats as magical and even demonic. And this is a historic, long-time historic association between cats and witchcraft, cats and sorcery, even cats and the devil. And so you're seeing on the left a print by Francisco Goya from his Capriccio series from 1799, and there's actually several cat pictures in that series. And this one shows a witch rising up into the air with her cat familiar. And on the right is a Gary Kelly print that's up in the exhibition, which shows the young blues singer Robert Johnson, who was thought to have sold his soul to the devil, right, for his musical skill. And so you see a cat associated with great artistic prowess, but also the kind of little demon tail of the black cat suggests that the cat is the devil that Robert Johnson sold his soul to. There is also a long-standing historic association between cats and women, which is, we'll see in a second, sometimes that's sort of an association between a virtuous woman and a well-managed home. And then sometimes it's not. It's about women of looser morals and how they're associated with cats. This is a painting that's dear to both of our hearts by the French 18th century artist Francois Boucher, called The Toilette, which shows a lady getting ready for the day, and there is there's a cat here conspicuously between her legs playing with a ball of string. And in the 18th century, it would have been evident to viewers that she was a lady of easy virtue, shall we say. And that association continues, as we know, up to today. And we've got in this great Lauterbach print called Dull Evening from the exhibition, in which you see cats associated with a woman who is, let's say, negligently dressed in a kind of nighttime cafe scene. There's actually two cats in here, one over here licking its private parts and one over here kind of prowling about. And there are many expressions, including the idea of catting around in English, that involve this relationship between cats and sexuality. This print actually also shows us something that is a well-known characteristic of cats, is that they're kind of liminal, meaning they're on the border of things. They're both inside and outside. Literally in this scene is they're kind of in and out of the scene. The space that she's leaning against is a doorway, sort of a place between in and out. And that also corresponds to the long-standing and actually evolutionarily true sense of cats as only kind of partly domesticated, that you never really control your cat, and it's sort of always a little bit wild.
That's right. And that sets up perfectly the point I want to make with this image here, which is that part of the fun of having a cat and living with a cat is this feeling that you are tapping into the kind of wild world of animals in a way that some other animals don't really let you experience. House cats are strikingly similar to big cats. They share almost completely their DNA with each other. And if you have a cat, you know that feeling of having the animal in your house and realizing that it is a little wild sometimes. I mean, cats sometimes go off and do their own crazy things. And you're not entirely sure why. There's a great quote by the French and 19th century writer Victor Hugo, which is that God created cats so that humans could caress the tiger. And the idea is that you are able, with a cat, to experience a little bit of the wild world of untamed nature, but you can have that in your house. And this cat is also something that's small and controllable to a point. And the cat is like giving you a little bit of a segue into a much wider world of animal life than some other pets that you could have would allow you to do. And this picture just shows that really well, because that's your house cat, and you look at the mountain lion on the right, and they're just so similar to each other. Genetically, they're more similar to each other than dogs are to the wolves from which dogs descended, just to put that in comparison for you.
And when we looked at the images in the artworks in the exhibition, we thought this Dürer print from 1511 kind of made that point in a really wonderful way. You have Saint Jerome here in his cell, working, writing, and at his feet is a lion, which is one of his his symbolic animals in Christian symbolism, but it's also curled up at his feet like a house cat. And I think that Dürer kind of captures that mutability between, is it a lion, is it a house cat, and that expresses something really true about even domesticated cats.
So one of the things that we have just recently been working on together is the way in which the spaces that artists work in, overlap with the spaces where cats like to hang out. And one of the things that we've discovered is that you basically can't look into the history of an artist, any named artist that you can study, and not find evidence of a cat somewhere. And so we've been thinking a little bit about how the studio in which an artist works might be a place in which cats also like to be. And, artists work in a kind of usually in a quiet setting. Artists like cats because they don't require an enormous amount of care. And cats like artists because artists are doing kind of meticulous work that maybe leaves the cat a little bit of quiet space that they can work in and enjoy a good nap. Like you see here in this painting by David Rickert, painters in a studio, painters doing various things that are in the process of making pictures, and you have a cat sleeping at the foot of the central artist over there. Cats are therefore very close to artists while they are making their art. And one of the things that we're thinking about increasingly is how cats, the presence of cats, might actually encourage artists to look at certain things in certain ways, might actually affect their sense of what they're doing when they make their paintings.
So tonight we sort of each chose two case studies of a single artwork or a group of artworks, sort of ranging from the 17th century up to the 20th century, to kind of trace this idea that about to say cats identifying with artists. No, with artists identifying with cats, and artists imagining their creative process to be essentially feline in nature. So we want to explore what that might mean through the case studies that we'll present to you today. So the first case study is of a very famous painting and a very famous painter from Spain, from the 17th century in Spain, Diego Velázquez, and his painting called The Fable of Arachne, or it's alternatively known as The Spinners. So this is famous, this artwork is famous in the history of art as being about the process of making art. And it is a classic of that genre. And to our eye, it tells us a lot about kind of the feline nature of artistic creativity. This was, Velázquez painted this in Spain around 1657. It's a multi-layered and very complex and often mystifying composition that combines a scene of classical mythology, which is way in the background, I'll talk about that in a second, with contemporary Spanish life. And it's always been a puzzling painting to viewers, and that was probably intentional on Velázquez's part. He really enjoyed presenting viewers with kind of a puzzle. So just to walk you through sort of how Velázquez put this puzzle together. In the deep background, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. In the deep background, in this scene back here, where you see a tapestry on the wall. You see a woman here standing in front of the tapestry, another woman mysteriously in a helmet raising her arm, and then I don't know what happened. It's okay on us, but it just went. Oh, okay, it's thinking about it.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, perfect, great. So that scene in the background is actually a scene from Greek and Roman mythology. It's a scene of the human weaver Arachne. Her name becomes important in a second, who's truly a great artist in tapestry making. And she brags about how great she is. And she says, I'm even better than Minerva, who's the goddess of the arts. And Minerva descends and is like, it's a kind of Devil Went Down to Georgia story where the mortal and the divinity are in competition. And in this one, the mortal is so good that the goddess has to acknowledge that her tapestry is better, that Arachne's tapestry is better than the goddess's, which makes the goddess very angry, and she turns Arachne into a spider, which is where the name Arachne is the one that's assigned to spiders. So there's this mythological scene about artistic power and prowess and hubris, and hubris being punished by the gods in the background. And then in the foreground, there is a scene of women in a textile workshop. They're not actually weaving tapestries, those workers. They're spinning the wool, the thread that will become the sort of material of tapestry in the foreground. It should be said that also one of the reasons that Minerva got so angry at Arachne is that the topic that Arachne decided to take on in her tapestry for the competition was a kind of spicy story about Minerva's father, Zeus, and his kidnapping and seduction of a mortal princess named Europa, which is known in art history often as the Rape of Europa. And it is it's a disrespectful scene about the goddess's father. So that made the goddess even angrier. What's interesting is that Velázquez, in choosing not only that topic, but that particular composition, and you can kind of barely see it here, but you've got Arachne, you've got just kind of the edge of a bull, because Zeus turned himself into a bull to seduce Europa and kidnap her, so you can just barely see that. And then, it's like pretty obscure, but educated viewers at the court of Spain at this moment would have recognized, let's see, did I go backwards? Let's see. Oh, I know what happened. Yes, would have recognized that tapestry that Velázquez depicts is actually a version of a very famous painting that belonged to the King of Spain on the same subject by the great Italian Renaissance artist Titian. So once you see them side by side, you can kind of see, okay, yep, the bull, the woman getting abducted, the putti flying in the sky do correspond to what Velázquez is doing. So Velázquez is kind of staging a competition with this older, extremely well-known artist in the way that Arachne is actually competing against a god herself. So this kind of interspecies story of sexual violence and animals is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is the foundation myth of Europe. Europa, the name of the girl who gets abducted, is the name Europe that ends up being given to the continent that she is alleged to have been the sort of founding mother of. So that's important. And the relationship to Titian is extremely important in this painting too. It's interesting also that Velázquez does not show us the scene of Arachne being turned into a spider. So he's not willing to go to full, like, let's see a human turn into an animal, but he's hinting at that sort of fuzzy boundary, pardon the pun, between human and animal, bulls abducting humans, a white weaver being turned into a spider. All of that is kind of in there. Then in the foreground, which is what we actually see and what we pay attention to, and for many centuries, the secret of that scene was lost, and people thought, literally in the 18th, 19th century, observers thought this was just a scene from a workshop of women spinning thread. So back there, in the front, what you see is women processing the raw materials of art making. They are literally taking bunches of wool. You can see wool down here and sort of wool balls here. And they are spinning thread to make that wool, and the wool will be turned into tapestries. That is really a kind of interesting story about production. Velázquez wants us to think about how are works of art made? What's that raw material what's the labor and the artistic labor that goes into producing something as sublime as this award-winning, this goddess angering, like competition-winning tapestry in the background. There are also a lot of moments in this painting where Velázquez is showing off his own skill. And here I'm showing you a scene of this woman who is looping thread. And it's a little hard to tell in the detail, but each one of these sort of threads of wool is actually just a drip of white paint. And so he's kind of making an argument. It's like, my paint is like the threads of wool that made the masterpiece that Arachne created. And this is one of the most famous flexes in the history of art, because this is a spinning wheel. This is spinning so fast that it's kind of blurring. And this is sort of a moment in which Velázquez is like, I am such a great painter that I can freeze time, that I can show you motion in a medium that's inherently not about motion. So what's interesting to us is that approximately 0.01% of the scholars, many of the scholars have written about this, and none of them, like 2 of them, have mentioned that there's a cat in this painting, which is, I put the arrow in there so you could see it's not super obvious. Sometimes the ones who mention it are like, they're like, oh, there's a cat in the painting, and then they just keep going to something they think is more important about this painting. But we think the cat is the most important part of the painting. And so here is a detail. You can see the cat's right here in profile, like fully in breadloaf position right there. And it's a pretty impressive cat. It is a very convincing cat. And Velázquez has taken trouble to just put it right there in the midst of the art, this workshop of all of these women who are laboring to create a wonderful work of art. And we want to know why. Like, why did Velázquez put this in here? Artists always have a choice. Everything they do is important and deliberate, and there's got to be a reason why this cat is in here. Well, we can certainly and we have done the historical research to say, oh, what did cats mean to people in the 17th century? And I can take you on a brief tour. There are certainly paintings from this time period that Velázquez would have known. Here's an artist who also worked at the Spanish court. And in those works of art, for instance, in this work of art, sort of a virtuous older woman, sort of pious and fairly not flashy, not sexy, is shown in an interior. And over here is her cat. And I can have a detail here. And I was particularly struck when I was doing this research of the juxtaposition of the woman's face, the cat, also in bread loaf position, and then a print. This is a print tacked to the wall and showing a saint. So there's like, this artist is showing a woman who is pious, who is virtuous, and the cat is sort of part of that atmosphere of piety and virtue. Also, there are religious paintings at this time period that are very careful to include cats into scenes like this one. This is an artist who was very active in the town in Seville where Velázquez grew up and where his early career was. So Velázquez would absolutely have known this painting. And this is a scene of the education of the Virgin Mary. There's her mother teaching her to read. And down in the bottom here, well, we're going to ignore the dog, okay? But we're going to pay attention to the cat over here in the corner. And this inclusion of the cat in a scene like this is about sort of the virtue and industriousness and the calm of this household of women. And it's particularly interesting because it's associated with textiles. And right here you can see, this detail's not great, but you can see the cat. It's got in its mouth a little bit of lace, which lace is really hard to make. It isn't a form of art itself. My colleague has written like an amazing article about lace, so we can take questions about that later. And the cat's being a little naughty, right? The cat is actually like stealing and eating the lace. But nonetheless, the cat is there and is lying down peacefully with the dog in a way to show this is a virtuous, calm household. We also get the sense that this artist, like Velázquez, knew cats. Like, this is a very cat thing to do, right? So this is, I think, an artist who really lived with cats and thought about them. So we think the Spinners is all about showing off. It's showing off Arachne's weaving skills. It's showing off Velázquez's painting skills. And the cat is also a kind of tour de force of painting. It's remarkably naturalistic. It's very convincing as a cat. And it shows off how good Velázquez is at painting animals. But I think it's also a reminder of the everyday world. Obviously, this is a whole mythological scene, crazy puzzle, and then there's a cat, which would have been familiar to any viewer who, even if you don't know about mythology, you do know about cats. And it's also a reminder that the everyday world kind of resists the artist, that had the sort of things of everyday life, the stuff, the material of everyday life, resists even an artist as powerful and as talented, as ambitious as Velázquez. It's there. It's not really doing anything. It's not working very hard. I will point that out. Everyone in this painting is working very hard, but the cat is just there. It's not participating in any of the human nonsense that's going on here. It's just kind of like contemplating, asleep on the floor of the workshop. So not only is that very authentically cat-like, I think it also reminds us that the raw material of the world and of art is something that the artist can't always entirely capture, conquer, sublimate. And Velázquez makes that very clear because the cat is down here among like the balls of wool, right? So it's there, sort of, its body is very much parallel to the raw materials of art right there. I want to make sure that I'm leaving enough time for Michael's example because I'm getting pretty enthusiastic about Velázquez here. But I will just say to conclude this first example that I think this is, Velázquez is okay with the cat in this picture being both inside the picture, sort of part of his artistic scheme, but also outside of the picture, being something that resists Velázquez, that ignores us, the viewers, that ignores everybody else in the painting. Velázquez is secure enough in his own artifice to be like, okay, there is this part of the world, a cat, which I don't need to conquer it. It is there. It can just be there peacefully, and it can ignore both the artist and ourselves. Yay! Okay, next example. Yes. We're jumping from the 17th to the 18th century.
Yes, to the 18th century. So we're going to move forward about 90 years, and we're going to leave Spain, where we just were, for that fascinating description of Velázquez's painting, and we're going to go to France. And I'm going to talk about this picture. This picture here. So it is pretty common in 18th century portraiture for people to be represented, the nobility particularly, with animals. And Amy has just, of course, alluded to the book that she has coming out in a couple of months, which is about hunt portraiture, among other things, in 18th century dogs.
Yeah, she's like,
yes.
No, dogs.
So mostly dogs. You see a lot of dogs in portraits of that period. Cats are a little less common. You don't see as many of them. And so I was really struck when I went to the Getty Museum a number of years ago by this portrait by the pastel and oil painter from 18th century France, Jean-Baptiste Perronneau, which is one of a pair of portraits that the Getty owns showing a married couple. The husband's portrait is a little bit more conventional, and I'm actually not going to show it to you. It's a little more typical of portraits at this time. But the portrait of the wife, Magdalene Prince-Loup de Lagrange, is interesting, very interesting, because of the inclusion of this cat. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of what's happening in this picture and how that cat kind of plays into the larger dynamic of what this picture is trying to do. If you look at her and you look at the cat, you will quickly see that there are many things that she and the cat seem to have in common with each other. They are both wearing a sort of beautiful clothing. The cat's clothing is, of course, its lovely fur. She's wearing the elegant clothing of an 18th century well-to-do woman. Her husband was involved in the textile trade, so they would have had access to very high quality fabrics, and you can see that. If you look at the color of her hair and compare the color of her hair to the color of the cat's fur, I think you can see a little bit of a similarity. They're almost the same color. And in addition to that, the cat is wearing a collar with bells on it, and that bell collar looks awfully similar actually to the pearls on her choker that she is wearing there. So it seems that this painting is going to great lengths to associate this person and this cat with each other. So if we push that idea just a little bit farther, we begin to realize that this is not just a portrait of a woman holding a cat, it is actually a double portrait. And that's something that's interesting to ponder a little bit because we're interested in the representation of animals. You know, there's certain pictures of animals that are a little bit more formulaic, like they just sort of throw a dog in the scene, or there might be a bird in the background of a certain picture. And it's really more just like a type that's there to represent a generic idea. And I think that's not what is happening in this picture. I think this is supposed to be a portrait of an actual living animal that lived with this woman and was her pet, if we can use that term, for this area of history. And the idea here is that it's documenting not just her identity, it's also documenting the identity of this cat. It, of course, also picks up on that theme of women and cats that we talked about before. This is a more respectable version of that subject than I think some of the other things that we've talked about. And I also want to make the point that this cat is not just represented with her, it's also personalized. And it's a little hard to see, but if you look at the paws of the cat, which are down here, you can see that the cat is doing that thing that cats do when they don't want you to hold them, right? So you've picked up your cat and you're holding it and it's starting to kind of take its claws and go a little bit like, put me down, right? And so there's this idea here that the cat is kind of resisting a little bit what is being shown in the picture. And that suggests to me several things. First of all, that Perronneau actually observed a real cat when he was making this image, and he's actually trying to sort of personalize that cat a little bit. But also that the cat is not something that can be reduced to just a prop in this story, that the cat has a personality, it has a will, it has a sort of sense of self, which of course, if you know cats, they always have, right? And the idea here is that the cat is really an actor in this story just as much as she is. It's really in some ways equal to her in terms of its psyche. The cat turns out to be interesting for another reason as well, which is that it turns out to be an early representation of a known cat breed. And one of the things we've touched upon a little bit in our research is that the history of cat breeds is very shallow. Like most cat breeds are fairly recent additions to the way in which cats have been understood, and there was a lot of confusion in the past about exactly what constitutes a cat breed. But this is a known breed, and that breed is a Chartreux. And if you know Chartreux, they are these big, stocky cats. They've been described as potatoes on sticks because they have these sort of big, kind of chubby bodies and beautiful chubby faces. And they were known for their beautiful, rich gray fur. And there's a whole sort of story that one can link this painting to of the importance of the Chartreux as a specifically French kind of idea of a cat. And just in the interest of time, I won't give you that whole background. It turns out that the Chartreux actually has a very similar genetic profile to other cats in that it probably originated somewhere in the Middle East, which is where most modern house cats have their origins. But at this moment in history, that wasn't really understood well. And the cat was thought of as a kind of French cat. It was a French type of cat. And it got the name Chartreux because that is a reference to the monks of an institution in southern France called the Grand Chartreuse. And these were famous French monks who wore a kind of gray costume. And the coloring of this cat recalled the coloring of that monk's dress that these monks wore, and that's how it got the name Chartreux. The thing about this cat that I always turn to is how much this cat is sort of self-consciously constructed out of paint. So this picks up a little bit some of the things that Amy was saying about Velázquez's cat, is that this cat is kind of like a self-consciously artificial representation of a cat, where the paint is sort of just as important as the representation. That's a very typical kind of 18th century way of thinking about a painted surface, is that you want the paint to be part of the experience of looking at the cat. And if you look at the colors that have been used to create the cat's face, you can link those to things in her clothing and her hair, like I said before, and other things. It turns out that cats were often described in language that is very similar to how people talked about paint. And when cats were first being imported into Europe from the Middle East, a couple hundred years before this, one of the ways that cats' coats were described by people who would write about them was by referring to painters and how painters would use paint, combinations of paint to create certain kinds of effects. So it's almost like the cat is a little walking work of art who is sort of like an example of painting itself and becomes almost a metaphor of the process of painting on its own. So there's your little Rococo moment. Now we're going to jump forward a little bit. Oh, actually, I have this the wrong way. We're going to jump forward a little bit to the very end of the 18th century and the early 19th century to talk a little bit about what happens to cats in art at that moment. That turns out to be a really important moment for the history of art, circa 1800. It's a transformational moment in which the political upheaval of that moment in Europe results in a massive transformation of the role of art in society. And this is a big subject that we don't have a lot of time to give detail about, but you should just know that the art after 1800 looks very different from art before 1800, and it starts changing a lot more quickly than art did in earlier time periods. One of the things we've noticed about that is that cats start to play a somewhat different role in the history of art than they ever did before, and they begin to take on new kinds of significance. And when artists are interested in making a picture that sort of describes the process of making art, they often do so by referring to cats. And so an early example of that I can show you here is this plate, probably the most famous image from Francisco Goya's series called Los Caprichos. It's a very famous print series of I forget, about 100 different images that formed this group of prints that he made. And the idea is that these prints show sort of the foibles of humanity, like the terrible things that people do, the ridiculous things that exist in society. And he wanted there to be an image in this that kind of summed up his entire view of what it means to be an artist at his moment of living. And the image he decided to make as that central piece, that central image, is this one here, which I give you the Spanish title up there. The common English translation of that is "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." It's a very famous image that is often talked about in the history of art as a kind of way of describing how creative processes are represented in works of art. And there's a complex story that we could kind of go into here. Very briefly, I'll just tell you that that's an artist. The artist has been up in the middle of the night. The artist has been making works of art. Like many artists, they're pulling an all-nighter and they fall asleep at one point. And when you fall asleep, your conscious mind kind of lets go a little bit and your unconscious kicks in, if I'm using Freudian terminology here, and your dreams and fantasies that happen in the middle of the night sort of become what you're thinking about. And they are often things that you don't have total control of and that are maybe a little bit scary and a little bit difficult to comprehend. So the owls that he has next to him there, you can see are turning into bats as they fly around. What often hasn't been talked about enough is that this image includes two cats, right? So there are two cats in this picture. There's the sort of very easy to see cat over on the lower right of the picture. And then there's another cat hidden behind him. And I'll talk about each of these very quickly just to give you a sense of them. The cat sort of to the bottom right is often described as a lynx. And there's a specific subspecies of lynx called an Iberian lynx that would have been known to Goya because it lives in the Iberian Peninsula and Goya is a Spanish artist. I don't think, however, that that cat is supposed to be a lynx that just kind of wandered in and decided to sit next to him in the middle of the night. That doesn't seem to fit what lynxes would normally do. I think that is supposed to be another typical house cat. But if you've lived with cats, you know that they often do strange things in the middle of the night. And it's often at night when the cat's more wild nature sort of expresses itself, right? And if you are groggy and half awake and you see your cat jumping across the room or something like that, you may have a moment where you mistake it for something that is different from what it is. And I think that transformational idea is what Goya is trying to express here, because of course that's what artists do as well. They're transforming what they see in the world into works of art. And I think that lynx-like cat is supposed to suggest that. It's also doing that thing that cats do where they're kind of looking in two directions at one time. If you ever look at your cat and they're kind of like, oh, their eyes are kind of tricking you a little bit, you get a sense of that happening there. The other cat is behind Goya. It's a dark cat. And that cat was originally in earlier versions of this, something that Goya worked on very extensively in order to figure out what was going to go in the central part of the print. And he came up with, there's several versions of this where he sort of tried out different things that he could put in that central spot before he decided that the best thing he could put there actually was a cat. And that cat kind of peeks at you. You may not even see it at first. It's looking directly out at you as the viewer of the image, but it's also sort of hiding itself a little bit from you. So there's an interesting kind of power dynamic there embedded in how the cat looks. So Goya is one example of this moment and how artists were transforming what they were doing in their work through representations of cats. Another artist, and one that I've really just been starting to think about this year, is an artist that I'm sure you've never heard of, whose name is Gottfried Mind. Gottfried Mind was actually Swiss, German-speaking Swiss artist who lived at the turn of the 18th into the 19th centuries. And he is someone who we probably today would refer to as being on the spectrum. In other words, he had some sort of developmental difference. Of course, the language used at that time is very different from the language that we would use today to describe such people. And it's always a little tricky to try to diagnose someone who lived 200 years ago using modern medical terminology. And I kind of don't want to do that. But I will suggest that he was differently abled from most people of his moment. And one of the things that he was very interested in doing in his life was making pictures. He was a bit of a savant in making pictures, and his number one subject that he liked to make pictures of was cats. And so what you see here is a picture by a contemporary printmaker showing Mind at work. He's the artist you see in the center there. What you may not be able to see is that there's a jar on the table in front of him, and it's cut off a little bit here, but that jar has a live mouse in it. So they've captured this mouse, put it in the jar with some things for the mouse to run around on, put a piece of cloth on the top so that the mouse can breathe, and then put it on the table. And the idea there is that the mouse runs around in the jar and keeps the cat active, keeps the cat busy, gets the cat's attention. And then Mind has an opportunity to observe the cat and make pictures of it. And what I'm going to show you now are a series of pictures that Mind did. I live near Sacramento, California. There's a museum there called the Crocker Art Museum, which has an incredible collection of drawings. And they have 30 drawings by this artist purchased by the Crocker family in the late 19th century that seem to me to be unusually subtle characterful and distinctive representations of cats doing what cats do. So here's a cat kind of leaning and rubbing its head against the ground. Here's a cat playing with string and with paper, two things that cats seem to have been attracted to across their history. And then here you have the classic combination of the cat and the dog, where the cat is swiping at the dog in order to keep the dog away from some food scraps that are on the ground. If you have a cat and a dog, you may have seen this exact scene sort of play out in your house. What I find interesting about this is that there's a real connection between cats and drawing. And it goes back really almost to, like as far back as we can go. And almost every major artist that you could name who made drawings made a drawing of a cat. And it's the more we look, the more we find. It's one of those sorts of situations. And just to show you how important those are, I brought in this very famous drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, which is now in the Royal Collection in London, in Great Britain, which is a famous scene because it is supposed to be a representation of cats. And the idea here is that Leonardo da Vinci is looking at real cats who are in his studio. But if you look at the cats, you can see that some of them are kind of like normal cats that you would expect to see in a domestic setting. Some of them become a little more lion-like. So it's clear that he's looking at the cats and thinking about how those cats can help him represent big cats, which, as we said before, are very closely genetically related to little cats. But then you look and see that a couple of the cats have sort of transformed into dragons, right? Which, of course, is not a real animal, right? It's an imaginary animal. But it's clear that the cat is spurring the artist on to be creative and to think in new ways and to come up with new ways of making his art. And the cat is almost like a kind of inspiration for the artist to do some of the work that he wants to do that he can't find in nature, right? So the cat is taking him to a place where he cannot normally go. There you go.
All right, we are going to make another 100-year leap in time, and our next case study is a painting by the great French painter Gustave Courbet called The Painter's Studio. This painting was an artistic manifesto on the part of Gustave Courbet. And we find it really interesting that this is an enormous painting. It's bigger than you're seeing it on the screen. It's at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And in the center of this kind of panorama of the artist friends on the right, the artist's subject matter, all these human subject matter on the left. There are all sorts of types that he would paint. And in the center, the artist, his canvas, a nude female model, a little boy, and you guessed it, a cat. This painting was the centerpiece of Courbet's one-man show that he organized himself. He had a huge ego, this guy, for the Universal Exposition of 1855, which was one of the original World's Fair that was held in Paris. So in the center of the scene, and we're going to get increasingly close to this cat, there's this sinuous, muscular, very furry, white Angora cat, which is attacking what appears to be, and we spent a lot of time looking at this in person, a horse chestnut, I think. There's some kind of a big acorn, essentially, right at the artist's feet. Now, Courbet was a real character. He was self-consciously cultivated the reputation of a rebel. And his most famous paintings, including this one, tackled subjects from everyday 19th century life, which at the time was a rebellious thing to do. So this is a gigantic painting of contemporary life as opposed to a religious scene or a scene from classical Greek and Rome. And Courbet was also very famous for his deliberate use of a very rough and ready paint handling technique, so that his paint, as we've talked about in other examples, when you get close, is very obviously unpolished and deliberately rough. He is, in fact, one of the artists, the preeminent artist of the movement we know as realism with a capital R, which was a whole sort of, again, we can get more into this in a Q&A, but it was a moment in time when he was one of a group of artists who were really committed to representing, quote unquote, real life. It's also interesting that Courbet's one of his artistic heroes was Diego Velázquez. And Courbet was not interested, as I just mentioned, in Greek mythology. He was, like Velázquez, interested in depicting contemporary workers. And as we can see in this parallel, they're both really interested in representing cats. In this gigantic painting, and I'm now just showing you a detail from the center, the cat is literally like the fulcrum of the entire composition. It's the only figure, human or animal, in this painting that overlaps with the artist figure, and there's just a moment where the cat's tail kind of approaches the artist's knee over there. And also, even in the coloration, the white cat, Courbet deliberately kind of matches that white paint so that it connects to the white paint on his artist's palette that he's holding. So the white paint that is part of his landscape that he's painting, the white drapery of the model, all of those things are tied in very deliberately by Courbet with color. Now, this is another painting on which oceans of ink have been spilled. And once again, as with Velázquez, almost no one has ever talked about the cat in the middle of the painting, which we find really perverse, considering that Courbet went to immense formal lengths to get this cat into the picture and to draw our eye toward it. And it's kind of crazy that no one really has worked through this. But we are here to save the day and to think about what is the conceptual work that the cat is doing. Why did Courbet put this in the painting? And it's kind of ironic to think about what work is the cat doing, because the cat is not working. The cat is playing. The cat is not interested in labor at all. It is having a good time. Now, there are a ton of associations we could make with the cat, and one of them, for instance, is that kind of provocative relationship between cats and women. We've got a sort of a naked woman in the center of this painting too, so that's very much there. Again, happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But tonight we want to highlight two important contexts for the inclusion of this cat. Number one, the fact that many of Courbet's friends seem to have had cats, loved cats, written about cats, and even specifically had white Angora cats, this is again a sort of early example of the breed now known as the Angora, and known then as the Angora cat. So that's context number one. Context number two is related to what we've been saying in all of our examples, that Courbet really believes in his own art that the best art is the art that makes the raw material, the raw sort of product processing that goes into art visible to its viewers in its most kind of unvarnished, untamed form. And I think that form to Courbet looked like a cat, and that is one of the reasons this cat is in here. Okay, we cannot find any evidence that Courbet himself was a cat dad. We tried. It doesn't seem to be true, but his artistic community, and those are the people on the right side of the canvas, are all his friends and his patrons. A lot of those people are famously and publicly cat lovers at this moment. So the one I'm pointing to with that arrow is a guy who they went by Champfleury, like Cher, like he just had one name. He was an art critic, he was a novelist, and he was the editor of a journal called Realism. So he's a fellow traveler with Courbet. They believe very much in the same artistic process, practices, and Champfleury is very famously a cat lover. At the time the painting was, Courbet was finished this painting, Champfleury was already working on a book called Les Chats, or Cats, which was finally published in 1869, and I showed you the sort of dull cover of it, but it's full of cat images by famous artists, Edouard Manet, Toulouse-Lautrec. There are like an enormous number of artists who contributed cat drawings and cat prints to this book. Figure number two in this painting, who's a big cat lover, is Charles Baudelaire, who is a famous 19th-century French poet. His most famous book of poems is called The Flowers of Evil, was published in 1857, so just a few years after this. And one of the most famous poems in that collection is called The Cat, in which Baudelaire talks about his love for his cat and also his love for a human lover, so kind of mingles those two. And here is a line, sort of a stanza from that poem in which basically Baudelaire is begging his cat to sit on his lap, which I think is all probably familiar to us who like cats. It says, "Come, my fine cat, against my loving heart, sheathe your sharp claws and settle, and let my eyes into your pupils dart where agate sparks with metal." So it's a kind of love poem to his cat and also begging his cat to pay attention to him. Then we have a third sort of guy in this group of friends, a guy named Théophile Gautier, who wrote about Baudelaire. And he said Baudelaire himself was a cat. Gautier said, Baudelaire himself was a voluptuous, cajoling cat with just its velvety manners, alluring mysteries, instinct, with power concealed in suppleness, fixing on things and men his penetrating look. And that kind of idea of the cat as just like far-seeing and just has a penetrating look is another reason why artists are really interested in cats, we think. I could not resist bringing in this portrait of Théophile Gautier, the guy who was just quoting about Charles Baudelaire, surrounded by cat. It's a caricature, utterly surrounded by cats, and then there's this cat very rudely showing us its butt, and Théophile Gautier himself wrote about his favorite cat was named Pierrot, who was a white Angora cat. So you can see all these guys seem to have, and there are women too in this artistic circle, have white Angora cats, and this seems to be somehow some kind of like a mascot of the artistic and literary set in Paris at this time. So certainly I think the feline presence in this painting is a nod to all of these white Angoras that are circulating in the social space. But we also think that the cat is talking about materiality. I'm going to try to just say this briefly because I want to make sure we get to our conclusion in a timely manner. So not only is that cat sort of referring to a bunch of real cats in Paris, but it's also a kind of, like the Perronneau, that when you get close to this cat, you realize that it's constructed of very obvious white paint strokes. And you can just kind of see, especially on the edges and the fur, this is Courbet soaking a brush in white paint and dragging it across the canvas, not blending. He wants you to see that. And the cat that's represented in that kind of raw way that shows us the paint that this painting is made out of is also shown in, as an untamed nature, hunting, living kind of instinctually, and again, ignoring all the other nonsense that's going on in the painting. And it doesn't have a collar, like Perronneau's cat. In many ways, this perfectly fits the way Courbet thought of himself as a kind of very independent artist who scoffed at critics, and actually Courbet becomes a literal revolutionary and is in 1870 and is part of a huge rebellion against the French state. So he has a political investment in this idea. So we'd argue by Courbet keeping this cat and putting this cat in his artistic manifesto, Courbet is saying, I'm a cat. I'm a cat artist, like Baudelaire was a cat poet. I'm beautiful to look at. He was famously vain. Partially domesticated, but potentially dangerous. And really, I am an animal at heart. Okay, good. We get to the sort of taking it into the 20th century.
So what happens after all of this sort of importance that we have been arguing that these cats play in the development of the history of art over more than 2 centuries? We've been making this claim that these cats are actually really significant and they do all sorts of really important kind of conceptual work for what artists are doing. Not surprisingly, at some point after all of that investment in the cat as an important figure in art making occurs, we find cats being turned into a joke. And what we've noticed is that there's a very specific moment in which this happens. And that is the 1870s, 1880s, the end of the 19th century. Suddenly, you start to find images like this one here, Henriette Ronner-Knipp, the young artist. And this is the sort of, Hallmark greeting card, calendar, cutesy image of a cat doing sort of silly little things and being kind of sweet and twee and kind of maybe a little sentimental, right? And it's like this moment just happens where suddenly all of the importance that we have been seeing for cats in works of art gets sort of neutralized, right? And we've tried to understand exactly why this happens when it does. It may have something to do with cats finally becoming I'm going to get out there and make people notice me and I'm going to be sort of part of the public discourse about art. They often turn to images of cats, among other things. So I want to give you 2 examples of that, one from high art, printmaking, and then one from popular culture, which I'm sure some of you will recognize. This is a print by the artist Johnny Friedlander, born in Germany, active for much of his life in France, became an artist and sort of reached his artistic maturity in the early 1950s. And he began doing experimental prints at that time, one of which you have upstairs in the show. And this is in the show upstairs, like I just mentioned, and it is Chat à la Lupette, which is cat with a magnifying glass. So it's associating the cat with this tool of looking, a magnifying glass, sharpening the gaze, like being able to look at something deeply. And at this moment, Friedlander was trying to experiment with different ways of making prints and trying to come up with new techniques for making prints look really different and interesting from how prints had traditionally been done. And to find it interesting that at this moment, when he's trying to kind of, really transform his career and transform his art making, he turns to making images of cats. So some of that value we've been talking about for cats clearly stuck around to the 1950s and was appealing to him at this moment. But a little bit closer to kind of the pop culture world that we all maybe mostly live in is this example here of the singer-songwriter Carole King. And I insisted that we put this in because I'm so into this. I think this is just,
I was
yeah,
too.
she
I'm
was into
sorry.
it too, but I'm just like, this just fits so perfectly. So Carole King, you all know because she is a well-known singer, had her heyday really in the 1970s. Prior to 1970, she was known mostly as a songwriter. She is the songwriter who created You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, which was, of course, a major hit for Aretha Franklin in 1968. Franklin, however, didn't write that song. It was written by Carole King. And starting in 1970, they wanted to develop Carole King as a kind of solo artist. And she produced a solo album in 1970. It didn't really chart, didn't really do anything. And then she produced a second solo album, which was going to be released in 1971. And in preparation for that, they did a photo session in her house in Southern California to try to give this idea of her as a kind of modern woman of the 70s, for those of you who maybe remember that moment. Sort of what was a sort of a kind of a woman of this era going to look like? They did a whole series of images of her sitting in front of this window, and none of them quite seemed right until the photographer, Jim McCrary, remembered that she had a cat. And so he went and got the cat, brought it over, plopped it on the pillow in front of where she was sitting, and took this picture. And this was the picture that ended up being on the cover of the album. McCrary apparently wanted to do this because he had read somewhere that people look at cats when they're in pictures. And one way you get people's attention is by including a cat in something. He sticks the cat in front of her so that you have to really look past the cat in order to see her. And the name of the album is Tapestry, and it refers, of course, to a kind of art making, which connects beautifully back to Velázquez, where we started. She's actually shown holding an embroidery, and embroidery was big in the 70s. The needle arts were a big thing at that period, and it was sort of something that women and men did as a sort of pastime. And the cat is included here as a kind of marker of all of those things. Ironically, this cat, which looks like it's going along with the game here, actually didn't want to be in the photo shoot and sat there just long enough for McCrary to shoot one or two pictures before it ran off and did whatever it wanted to do. But that also leads us to the realization that this is a picture of a real cat. This is not a stunt cat or an actor cat that was brought in just for effect. This is her actual cat. And so we have the history of this cat. His name was Telemachus. And he is really, in some ways, part of the story of that very famous album cover that made her career. And that, of course, that album was a multi-million-dollar major success. I've called it the soundtrack of the 70s because all of the songs on that album ended up becoming major, major hits and are known probably to many of you in the room right now. And that brings us back to where we are today, right? Like you have cats on your phone. I have cats on my phone, both cats from works of art and actual cats that I have owned, lived with, and encountered. And the internet is in some ways the perfect medium for conveying pictures of cats, right? So much so that it has been joked kind of half seriously that actually maybe cats kind of forced us to create the internet so that we could use it to share pictures of them with each other because the sheer number of cats that exist online is staggering. And it's a sign of how image making, picture making, human experiences, including art making, and cats seem always to kind of come together in this sort of little connection that we can trace all the way through the history of art, and that we are somehow still doing today in the new technological ways that we have. The creative spirit that cats enable us to tap into is something that now we all do, and so we're all sort of artists creating our own images of cats. That's
I
it.
think we can
Yeah.
can leave it there. We would love to answer your
Yes.
questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Perfect. Yay.
I see a question
Yeah.
back there. Can we just ask you to yell out?
Okay. Have you painted yourself a cat that you put in your book? And the first page of your book, a picture that you painted.
So the question is, have we painted any pictures of cats that we could put in like the first page of our book? The answer is neither of us have those skills, but I will tell you that we have seriously thought about, even before we finish the book, like what are our author photos going to be? And I think they pretty much had better include cats in them.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Or just be cats.
Yeah, neither of us really makes art, so yeah, I've never tried to paint. God help me, I would never be able to do it, right? And so, yeah, no.
Yes.
What about the famous series of cats painted by people with schizophrenia? Have you done
No, I haven't looked.
research on that?
Interesting. The question was about this series of pictures of cats created by people with schizophrenia, and have we thought about those?
So the answer is no, I haven't thought about that. So I'd love to hear, what you're referring to. I've done some work on artists who are associated with insanity or in various kinds of mental issues. The MIND part of this discussion sort of goes a little bit in that direction. But no, I haven't actually looked into that, I mean, yeah.
Come up and give us a
Yeah,
reference
tell us
later.
where we
Yeah.
should look
Yeah.
for.
Other questions we can answer? Is the bar still open? Maybe it's time to release people into the world. Please, I'm sure that everybody here has already seen the exhibition, but we encourage you to go back and take our ideas and test them against the works of art you have in this wonderful exhibition upstairs.
All right.
Right.
Thank you. Yay.
Yay!
Yay. I'm clapping for you. Yay.
Yay.
That was so fun.
That was so fun.
Yes. We're the cat duo.
Sorry, we went a little.
Oh,
We're a little
yeah.